Hendriks, we're very pleased to have with us, in advance of the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, which is observed this Friday. We have three guests with us. Sarah Hendriks, the Director for the Program Policy and Intergovernmental Division at UN Women. Delphine Schantz, Head of the New York office of the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. And Calliope Megiro, also of UN Women. And, sorry, what can I say about your title?
I'm the chief of the Violence Against Women section.
Oh, the chief of the Violence Against Women section of UN Women. And so they will speak to you and then take some questions. Ms. Hendriks, would you care to go first?
I will start.
Okay.
Because I'm the one providing the statistics.
Okay.
She's the one providing the policy recommendations.
Okay.
It's a joint venture.
All right.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to present this report by UNODC and UN Women on the gender-related killings of women and girls, which is often referred to as femicide or feminicide. This report is being launched to mark the International Day to Eliminate Violence Against Women and to call attention about the problem and to call for potential actions. So UNODC, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, had issued a report on gender-related killings last year, and we had highlighted the problem of femicide in our global study on homicides. But this year, we're very happy to join forces with UN Women and issue this 2022 report. So as a result of our partnership, this year's report has been extended to focus on including different stakeholders, and particularly women rights groups that have been a possibility to provide some inputs into this report, but also to include some key policy recommendations, both from criminal justice responses, as well as some multi-stakeholder responses and support services. So this recommendation highlights the urgent need for more and better data collection, and because we almost certainly have underestimated some of the data that are contained in this report, and there is still a lot that we do not know about femicide. So let me know now, just to give you an overview of those figures. So the report presents global, regional, and sub-regional estimates of gender-related killings of women and girls in the private sphere in 2021, and I insist on the private sphere aspect of it. Globally, there is an estimated of about 81,000 women and girls who are victims of homicides in 2021. The majority of those homicides have been femicides, which means that there was a gender-related motivation behind these killings. An intentional killing of women and girls by intimate partners or family members is just only one type of femicide. So femicides happens mostly at home, around 56% of the total female homicides. Around 45,000 women and girls worldwide were killed last year by their intimate partners or family members, which means that on average, more than 5 women and girls are killed every hour by someone of their own family. Most killings are recorded in Asia. So looking at the rate of the female killed by intimate partners or family members with regard to the population of 100,000, Africa records the highest number of killings. But there is a clear lack of updated and disaggregated data. This is in sharp contrast with homicides committed against men and boys, who account for about 81% of all homicides, and only 11 of those homicides are committed in the private sphere. We also examined the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdown measures on femicides. And from this data, we can say that the year 2020 has been particularly deadly, with a particular increase in North America of 9%. But some increase were also recorded in Western Europe and Southern Europe, but this was not such an exceptional increase compared to previous year-on-year changes. Declines in femicides have been recorded in Central America and the Caribbean in 2020, but this cannot really make any real conclusion because we've not yet recorded all some of the statistics. So we will not be able to provide any conclusion based on these figures. So I really encourage you to look specifically on this report with regard to some of the regional trends. And let me make one last point. Of the total female homicides in 2021, roughly 4 in 10 have no contextual information that will help to identify the victims if the victims were victims of gender-related killings. So more specifically, we do not know anything about the victim-perpetrator relationship, and this is a very, very crucial information that needs to be recorded by official statistics. There's even less data available on gender-related killings committed in the public sphere. So these type of femicides include rape murder, gender-motivated homicides connected with armed conflict or with gangs, trafficking in persons, or other forms of organized crime. So we do not have enough quality information, comparable data, to provide estimates for these types of killings. So not having enough data makes it harder to stop these crimes and to get, like, especially an early warning and to develop a policy. So this is why UNODC and UN Women have developed a framework which was approved earlier this year by the UN Statistical Commission to provide standard statistical definitions and categories to help countries measure and count all types of gender-related killing of women in crime. So I will stop you there, and then we can move to more like the policy aspect of this report, and I hand over the floor to Sarah. Thank you.
So, thanks very much, Ms. Schantz. So we'll now turn to Sarah Hendriks.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. The figures certainly that have just been shared with you are particularly worrisome, and they're very sobering. Femicide rates remain at alarming levels, with more than 5 women or girls killed every hour by someone in their own family. And we know, of course, that behind every data point, behind every statistical point, is actually a lived life. It's actually a real woman or girl whose life has been very brutally and often very abruptly ended just because she is a woman. This is a global emergency, and it must stop. The good thing is we know what the solutions are. We've seen the following solutions be effective: increased investments in comprehensive approaches that address legislation, prevention and services for survivors, including training for law enforcement officials and the police, prosecution of perpetrators, and access to justice for survivors, as well as measures to transform toxic masculinities and to transform social norms. The report, as you've just heard, shows that there's a very mixed picture across the world. We do need more research. We also need clear, disaggregated data on such killings and criminal justice responses to better understand what are those driving factors, what's actually underlying this as an emergency, to understand what is driving increased femicide in certain contexts. We also need to know what are the factors where we're seeing the data go down and what's driving the decreased femicide rates in other contexts. This will very much help to inform policy and to inform prevention strategies. We are jointly, UN Women and UNODC, launching this report now, very intentionally, ahead of the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, which takes place on November 25th every year, and the start of the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. The UN Secretary General launched what is called the Unite campaign in 2008 to support the civil society-led 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence campaign. And every year there's a new theme, and this year the theme of that campaign is activism to end violence against women and girls. So why a focus on activism in particular? I think first, there's some very rich and robust evidence that tells us that countries with strong and autonomous women's rights movements have actually made more and greater progress in preventing and even reducing violence against women. This is a correlation, but it bears out to show that relationship. Secondly, because we need to mobilize more people across communities and societies at large to become activists on this issue, to hold governments accountable, to ensure that there is prevention and response to violence against women and girls. And while we know that women's rights organizations certainly play a very, very crucial role, they alone cannot be responsible to end violence against women and girls. But we also know that today's women's rights organizations are operating in an increasingly complex environment where they're facing threats to their very survival, where they're facing a significant shrinking space for civil society, and where there's a growing backlash against civil society and against women's rights in particular. So as we kick off this 16 days of activism in what we call to orange the world, you'll see some orange being worn here as a representative color for this campaign. We want to urge all leaders, including leaders of the Generation Equality Action Coalition on Gender-Based Violence, and all actors across the world, including the UN, to advance solidarity in 4 concrete actions. Number 1 is to increase long-term and predictable funding to support women's rights organizations. We're inviting donors and stakeholders to make commitments through the Generation Equality Action Coalition on Gender-Based Violence, as well as through donations direct to civil society organizations through the UN Trust Fund and through something called the Spotlight Initiative. Secondly, we're seeking to ensure that we amplify the voices of feminist women's movements in all their diversity, to mobilize more actors to join this global movement to end violence against women. Thirdly, to promote the full and equal leadership and participation of women and girls in political and decision-making spaces. And finally, to strengthen protection mechanisms that both prevent but then also eliminate violence against women human rights defenders and against women's rights activists. We certainly call on everyone to play their part, knowing that violence against women and girls touches all of our lives across every country. We believe that every single one of us can make a difference. And that's why we call on all to unite as part of this campaign to end violence against women and girls. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Calliope Meguro, do you have any words? Or? Okay. All right. So given that, I'll open up the floor for questions. Edie.
Thank you very much on behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association for doing this briefing. My name is Edith Lederer from the Associated Press. I briefly looked at the report because I was trying to figure out exactly where the 45,000 number of killings that you report came from. And I note that the report says that as of 2021, only 133 UN member states have reported data that distinguish between male and female homicide victims, and as of 2021, only 97 UN member states provided information on the victim-perpetrator relationship or other contextual information that would allow for the identification and counting of gender-related killings of women and girls. So, are the 45,000 figure that you came from those 97 countries? And does that mean that the other nearly 100 member nations of the United Nations, you just don't know the numbers from that large number of nations.
Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for the question, and it's really at the core of our statement is we probably underestimate the overall figures that are contained in this report. Yes, indeed, those 45,000 would come from those states that, the number of states that you've listed. However, you will see as an annex to this report the whole methodological framework that we've been using to compile those data. So you will see that we've been using statistics provided by member states, and they're all recorded publicly available on the UNODC website. But you will, we've been also using a lot of public sources, so that helps us determine some of the potential trends, some of the figures, although this is not something that we would count because we only based information on real statistics we receive from member states, but that enables us to see whether there is some of the particular focus that we should place on a particular country. And this is why we've really come up with this framework to be able to list some specific categories and so that we can provide this assistance to member states and get better statistics from them. So not only the number of homicides, but within the number of homicides, which one have been committed, which one were the women, the culprit, the victim, and in this particular case, whether it happened in the private sphere, in the public sphere, and in which context. Because what's very important is the motivation behind and is the contextual information, and this is what is missing.
So is it correct to say that the 45,000 figure is based on the information from the 97 countries?
And if I could just add to that, gender-related killings of women and girls is absolutely a crime that continues to go both under-detected and under-reported. And it's very often not appropriately classified by authorities. So that relates to the question you're posing in terms of what's actually reported by member states. Globally, there are significant data gaps and inconsistencies in the definition of gender-related killings, particularly those perpetrated outside of the domestic sphere. And this is why the point that was just made on contextual factors is so important. Because we all know context matters. We know that about everything in this world. But in this particular issue, context very much matters. So we see a criticality to move beyond a crime statistics approach where homicide victims are simply counted to an approach where the data is disaggregated by sex, to an approach where the relevant characteristics of the actual victims, such as the victim-perpetrator relationship and other contextual factors, such as the gender-specific motivation of a crime, are recorded on a routine basis in line with a statistical framework. In my life, I've known 4 different women who've been killed by gender-related femicide. And in each of these situations, it was not recorded as a femicide. And so this approach to shifting the statistical gathering of this data is absolutely critical to be able to track and understand that context, because context matters. Thank you.
And if I may, just because we have the context, but then, as we know, if we want to be effective on the policy response, we need to be able to provide some very solid and consistent set of data. Because only based on data and seeing of the figures, which are, very concerning, but obviously probably underestimated the actual reality, considering the number of states we managed to get data from, then we will be able to actually have some stronger weight in terms of policy recommendation and implementation of those policies. Thank you.
First of all, thank you so much for doing this briefing today. I know, especially in this time in the world, how much it matters to women around the world. My name is Mariam Ramadi, Iran International. First, as a woman leader, feminist woman, and UN woman especially, I want to hear about what is going on in Iran and the violence that women of Iran are taking right now from the government. Any one of you, if you have a statement regarding to that. And also, I want to just ask a question about honor killing in countries like Afghanistan and Iran. And as you touched on how important it is to have official statistics and the governments to give you those statistics. Like in countries like Iran and Afghanistan, women are being killed and the families who have done it are going free by their life, and the law and the government are not supporting women. So what is your approach to countries like Afghanistan, facing Taliban right now, or in Iran, Islamic Republic of Iran, who are actually literally against women, and women in these countries do not have any kind of support. So what would be your plan to make these countries accountable for what they're doing themselves, or how they are not supporting women in case of femicide or honor killings? Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question and indeed the timeliness of it. I'll answer in two parts if I can. First, to respond directly to your question around Iran specifically, and then more broadly on what UN Women is doing in particular in Afghanistan. So on Iran, certainly UN Women has issued two public statements on the situation in Iran, which are available on our website. These were issued in September, on September 22nd and on the 27th. And UN Women absolutely is standing in solidarity and upholds and supports the full exercise of women and girls' rights in Iran. We believe that these rights are established and enshrined in international human rights frameworks, including CEDAW and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. These human rights frameworks clearly state the importance, and they verify UN Women's support for the rightful demand to protest, for injustice without reprisal, and for the right to be free to exercise bodily autonomy. So those are three rights that we see as being critical. Our public statements have unambiguously demanded that the government and authorities in Iran enable the expression of women's full rights in a safe environment without fear of violence, without fear of reprisal, without fear of prosecution or persecution. We have joined with others in terms of adding our voice to call for an independent, impartial, and prompt investigation, and for those held responsible for violating these rights to be held accountable. UN Women stands ready to provide very explicit gender expertise to the assessment and investigation of rights abuses in country. In terms of what support UN Women has provided to the women of Iran, UN Women is not present in Iran as a direct office. However, the UN system is in Iran. And the UN system provides extensive support to women and girls in Iran. For example, UNFPA provides sexual and reproductive health services, including safe spaces for women and girls, as well as clinical management training for rape cases in particular. UNDP supports women's economic empowerment, particularly in terms of vulnerable women in rural and deprived areas, as well as for female-headed households in Iran. And UNICEF supports vulnerable women and children refugees, as well as in border host communities, particularly in terms of nutrition as well as health services. Our team in our regional office is providing distance support to the country through our regional office in Asia Pacific, as well as, of course, at our headquarters level. In terms of your broader question on honor killings and how to hold those in authority to account for the violations and abuses of women's rights, indeed, UN Women works together with women's civil society in order to both create space but also hold space for women's rights to be protected, respected, as well as amplified. The women's movement is one of the key engines in driving progress on women's rights in Afghanistan. And UN Women made a very important decision to stay and deliver for women and girls in Afghanistan. As part of that, UN Women is providing technical support to the humanitarian response in Afghanistan and to ensure that women's rights organizations in Afghanistan are supported both financially as well as with important critical platforms for their voice. I hope that's helpful in response to your question.
And thanks very much. Are there any further questions? If not, I'd like to thank my guests, Delphine Schantz of the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, and Sarah Hendriks and Calliope Migiro of UN Women. Thanks very, very much for your briefing. And next up is Paulina Kubiak, the spokesperson of the President for the President of the General Assembly.